Hello. I'd like to look into something concerning a diagnosis that is all too often given by psychiatrists and persons in the helping professional field when it comes to emotional struggles. And that is the concept of bipolar disorder. I'd like to say some things that I've noticed about this diagnosis. First of all, it is something from the Western sphere of the world, not the Eastern sphere. I don't think you would find too many Buddhists talking about people having bipolar disorder. And perhaps the West might like to counter this point by saying the West is more scientific, whereas the East is almost entirely intuitive, or so it's claimed. That the East also might be rather backwards, particularly in India, it might be said, compared to certain portions of the West, again, claimed to be cleaner, more scientific, and more double-blind studies conducted, etc. So we have this to consider, I think. And secondly, the diagnosis of bipolar disorder has not been around forever. I would have to look into the specifics, but I would say that probably it hasn't been around more than 100 years at most. And furthermore, it's probably only with the advent of certain psychiatric drugs that this would even be diagnosed at all, because otherwise, how would you even treat it? Whereby in the past, then, certain things would be called deficits in other avenues, to include religious deficits, say. And so perhaps a disease doesn't even get called a disease until there's a treatment, a viable treatment of some sort to address it. And additionally, this diagnosis has shot through the roof in prevalence level over the years, perhaps the last 20 years, say. Some would say, well, this is simply a reflection of more and more understanding of a condition that's alluded to, but there could be a lot of other factors involved, I think. Now, I would say that bipolar disorder, the term, always refers to, in the psychiatrist's mind, as being a mood disorder. Not really an anxiety disorder, as they would put it. But I would have to wonder about this and wonder if we ought to look at this more closely. For the hallmark sign or criteria for diagnosing bipolar disorder, so to speak, is that this person first have had one, at least, manic episode. But what really is a manic episode? I kind of think that a manic episode would be a panic episode, whereby, for any number of reasons, a person might experience something, either situationally or some memory from the past or some fear about the future popping up in their mind and causing extreme panic compared to ordinarily. Kind of like a blip on the radar all of a sudden. Well, then what would you expect but panic? For instance, let's say we lost our job, or got a diagnosis of cancer, or broke a bone, or our spouse asked for divorce, or a number of things that could happen. Then, of course, for some, this might not be far as serious in their minds as to others who might panic and And I would say then this panic is a form of extreme anxiety and takes on very predictable forms. You could say this person is thus having a manic episode because they're in chaos in the mind. And this chaos then is compensated for, I would say, in very predictable manner, to include very rapid thinking. In general, chaotic thinking, anything that will get your mind so discombobulated that you can't think straight, and thus you can't think about the trauma or potential harm coming your way, or what suddenly has popped into your life that's very painful. What better way for some to block it out if they don't have defense mechanisms like obsessive compulsiveness or drug use, or let's say a lot of allies or a lot of money in the bank, or good emotional support or religious support, church membership? What better way to block out painful things suddenly popping up on the radar than to work yourself in a frenzy, almost unconsciously, to thus effect a blocking out of painful things suddenly popping up. Now, if one were to look on YouTube or in some writings, you would see that rapid thinking in general can be called racing thoughts. And this is not a small thing to be talked of. It's talked of all the time on YouTube, etc., that so-and-so so-called bipolar person has racing thought problems. But isn't racing thoughts a great way to block out painful things happening emotionally to you? Usually by something specific happening and overwhelming us, and we're being unprepared to cope with it. Even possibly intellectually unprepared to cope, if we can't think logically very well or don't have the time to. Or if somebody is causing us to catastrophize something that really shouldn't be. So at any rate, I see that this racing thought phenomenon then, if it gets out of hand, could be called a manic episode. And it's totally up to the discretion of any particular helping professional as to what they want to call a manic episode. Even what kind of clothing the person is wearing when they show in an office, or how much money they have in general, or how respectful they are toward the practitioner even. For a respectful client, I'm sure, would get a diagnosis far less stigmatizing than someone very disrespectful toward a practitioner and their profession in general, or let's say the personality style of that particular professional. And so the rendering of the concept that so-and-so has a manic episode going on, I think, is extremely variable, subjective, and not just subjective, but up to the reaction even of the practitioner toward the particular person presenting. For who hasn't heard the phrase that so-and-so is running around like a chicken with their head cut off? Or, I remember in one movie, I'm trying to remember the name of it, with Harvey Keitel, where a priest in the movie says words to the effect that everybody is waiting and in fear, basically, of someone coming along and pulling the chain, and they're going down the toilet, so to speak. So, this alluding to, I think, modern man in the Western world, crowded world, competitive world, very fearful, even terrified oftentimes, of what could suddenly happen to them. And in fact, I think oftentimes something does suddenly happen. And voila, all of a sudden then, panic city, people running around like chickens with their heads cut off double time. Well, this could surely be called a manic episode, and then the diagnosis of bipolar disorder given. And once that's given, well, things tend to progress, I would say. And a person would be worked into the system for life and called incurable. Now, why would we even find ourselves living lives so often of panic city, so often chaos, or even what Henry David Thoreau said, whereby most people are living lives of quiet desperation? Why the panic city so often? Why do we feel so precariously situated? Well, I'm reminded of a couple things from history. For instance, with the movement of industrialization coming in several hundred years ago in England, say, I'm reminded of the story of Mr. Carnegie, whose father was a weaver of linens. And when the industrialized era came in, the mechanical looms came in and he lost his work. So he and his family came to America to try and survive, at least at their current standard of living, economically, that is. But of course, at quite a price, perhaps. Maybe they had to come into a more chaotic situation in America, as opposed to what they had in Scotland. But at any rate, this, along with the move to the urban areas then, causes a lot of stress, I'm sure, by overcrowding and noise, long work hours, and inflexibility, and having to work for others, often very pressuring bosses. Whereas before, many people worked for themselves or their fathers, family businesses, etc. I think Mr. Durkheim, for instance, talks extensively about this sociological change from agrarian lifestyles to urban lifestyles, and I would say then the pressure incurred. I would also say that overpopulation has been more and more of a problem. Let's say especially in the last 40, 50 years perhaps, and it's accelerating. One man, I think his name might be Ken Iglesias, said in a book recently on roaming across lands that there's going to be 60 million more people in the United States than what there were a few years ago, say around 2018. So, with industrialization so strong now and this kind of pressure, with overpopulation, then of course I think more and more people would find themselves at least occasionally, if not always, running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And surely this could be initially diagnosed as a emotional and even biological problem. First of a so-called manic episode, followed by mood fluctuations. But indeed, you could argue, I think, that this is largely, if not entirely, a sociological problem. But then, if we were to say that, this opens up a huge can of worms as to why we're so overpopulated now and what to do about it. We're talking conflicts in morals, conflicts in religions, conflicts across the board. So rather than deal with these conflicts and the elephant in the room issue, I suppose it's much easier, more efficacious in the short run anyway, to simply sweep it all under the rug and call it a biological condition, which, by the way, then happens to be treatable how conveniently with drugs, called antipsychotics or mood stabilizers. But I would say, too, that sometimes perhaps the mood issue isn't the biggest issue. The fluctuating moods, supposedly. Some so-called bipolar people don't even have mood fluctuations. Or others have had pretty peachy keen lives after an initial diagnosis for, say, 10 years, and are simply told they're in remission. Well, what happens if their lives are pretty even keel for 50 years? Are they still in remission? Who gets to say and who doesn't? For instance, if you had pneumonia and you got a shot of penicillin and it went away, has the disease and problem gone away, or are you in remission for a period of 5, 10, or 20 years till you get pneumonia again? Or let's say emotionally until you lose your job again or get divorce proceedings against you again, or go bankrupt again. And as for fluctuations into depression, I have a brother-in-law who is from India, and he refers to depression as simply being bummed out, which I think is pretty darn astute. For if you were to look at material on suicides, you would find that counselors talk all the time in these books that the basic issue is hopelessness. And hopelessness then arguably causing so-called depression, but better term being bummed out, I'd say, hopeless. So a person under much stress and running around like a chicken with its head cut off, trying to fix the solution in a panic, is surely sometime going to collapse and just say, I give up, or it's hopeless. They're going to stop struggling, stop trying to fix, give up, say it's hopeless, and basically they're depressed. Hence, you could argue a cycle between trying in a panic versus not trying at all, depression. And for some, this would be a cycle, and others, you could simply say they're stuck all the time in panic, and yet others resolve these panicky situations and are termed to be in remission for an indefinite period of time, perhaps as much as 10, 20, 30, 40, and even 50 years in remission. When the original problems causing the panic could have been resolved long ago. Now, there are, of course, all kinds of panicky situations I think many, but many others not, do face. For instance, I rented apartments for many years, sometimes very troubling ones. I would call some of them flop houses, actually, not apartments. And there's the fear of evictions, for instance. And if you were to watch videos on YouTube, you would see that many evictions are conducted with police presence with guns drawn from the very moment of start. Or take the matter of losing your job, whereby, let's say, in Japan many years ago, if you got a job, it was for life typically in a company. But not today, probably not there, and not here definitely. In fact, most factory work has been outsized to other countries. So then what happens if you don't have any money in the bank? Or you're not even married anymore, divorce being through the roof, and religion taking second or third fiddle now, too. And many social supports in general gone, such as alluded to in Mr. Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. Well, I suppose you could say, well, there's always the homeless shelter for these unlucky. But as one person told me who was a social worker 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, he said anybody can end up in a homeless shelter. Well, I wouldn't say anybody myself, but many could. And then what? We know they're overcrowded. Your items you bring with you could be subject to theft. Some people there are violent. You could get a disease. And in the daytime, you're typically put out during the day hours onto the street, where you're subject to arrest for vagrancy complaints by store owners, for instance. Especially if it's cold out and you can't stand the cold. And then if you're in prison, you're going to be subject to possible rape, violence from Latino gangs, violence from all sorts of avenues, pressure to join gangs in prison, and if you don't, you'll pay the price, and if you do, you could very easily get into trouble and have your sentence extended. So, this is all not a piece of cake, and I think many people realize this on some level of consciousness or unconsciousness. Life is not a cakewalk, especially in America with the most prisoners per capita population of any nation on earth. It's a big business, in fact. These prisons aren't just overcrowded for no reason at all, or because there is supposedly so much crime. Well, it's big business. And as one prisoner, or rather guard, said, they turn the other eye to rapes going on in prison to keep the population down, especially in the winter, to make it less likely to be a very comfy homeless shelter in and of itself. More comfortable sometimes otherwise than a homeless shelter, in fact, because you're not kicked out during the day into the cold or subject to sudden arrest. And of course, we know that many things are so arbitrary these days, especially in American courts. It depends a lot on what lawyer you get. Mr. O.J. Simpson bought himself the finest lawyers in town, and look what happened. He got off scot-free on something many people say would never have taken place if he hadn't had that lawyer. And secondly, what allies do you have? Which buddies if you get in a pinch? And looking at the divorce scene, I think many people are scared of a divorce. They're afraid of basically getting cleaned out if they had a divorce. So I see in general a huge amount of unpredictability in our society, especially with the start of industrialization, but just in general. With that much unpredictability, people say to themselves, well, anything could happen at any time with almost catastrophic circumstances, perhaps. Even if you end up in prison and you get out in a year or two, your reputation is toast. And you'll be lucky to get a job as a bagger at the local grocery store or McDonald's. You'll be lucky. Now, there are many who would say that America has a huge problem of income disparity, but I would say probably not. For I say the real issue is not income disparity, like who has the Rolls Royce or Lexus even, and who has the clunker, or even riding a bicycle or walking to the grocery store. I don't think that's the issue at all. It's a matter of who gets to have housing that's not overcrowded and basically chaotic, noise-filled, full of crime, bad for your children. And issues like that. And transportation, who has to ride a crowded bus and wait for it in the heat, cold, sleet, rain? And who has to ride with some people who are quite challenging on the bus versus who gets to ride in a comfortable car, alone if preferred. And of course, though, this is not just a income level problem. If you're a professional, especially a medical professional, they are also afraid of getting sued, and so they want to take on clients that are only going to be complacent in the first place, very trusting, And secondly, they want to prescribe tests right and left to cover any possible liability from a lawsuit. In fact, many lawyers will be willing to fight for your medical lawsuits on a basis of shared income, so to speak, if they were to win, thus encouraging lawsuits, and doctors very terrified these days. So even the doctors are running around like chickens with their heads cut off, arguably bipolar, you could say, depending on who they go see, if they ever see anyone. I would also say, in fact, that while some say the incidence of bipolar disorder, so to speak, is through the roof, this doesn't even begin to address how many people never see a psychiatrist for emotional struggles. For if all of us went, all 100% of us went to a psychiatrist complaining of whatever and seeking their 2 cents worth at a minimum, I bet you 90% would come out with something on the order of bipolar disorder being diagnosed, or at least very high numbers until it looked quite suspicious. Indeed, if there were a diagnosis called modern life disorder, or overpopulation disorder, or urban disorder, or post-industrialized era disorder, I bet you everybody would be diagnosed with this except those few living in Tibet, or Bhutan, or tiny villages in China, hundreds and hundreds of miles from a nearest Walmart, so to speak. And of course, if there were a diagnosis of urban mental disorder or overcrowded mental disorder, well, I suppose there would be a pill to fix it called anti-urban disorder pill. Now, of course, the so-called diagnosis of bipolar disorder is said to be for life and very refractory. And I would say that in part this could be possibly true to the extent that use of racing thoughts from time to time to cope with high levels of anxiety is probably a situation very hard to root out. And why? Well, I would say for one reason because it's hard to break away from the rat race. The urban style of living, even suburban style of living. How many people decide they want to go to the country and take up that way of life? Homesteading. How many people want to go RVing in the national forests or Bureau of Land Management areas? Well, a few, but probably not many, and probably not until retirement age often, if that at all. And even this issue of overcrowding, I think, begs the question in a certain sense of what more is going on here nowadays. For there is the fact that there's a lot of open land still in this country, maybe not so much in Europe, Western Europe, but yes, in this country, and many small towns available if people wanted to live there. And you don't even have to live in town, in a small village of, say, a couple thousand. You could live out in the sticks a few miles out. So then what's the issue here, I would say, wondering? I suppose a big issue is related to many people preferring urban living these days. For instance, in China, all the small villages are emptying out and going to the urban $20 million or 20 million populated cities. Even Mexico has many people tired of small-town village life and wanting to come to America where, quote, the action is. But then what gives on all that? Why would people want this chaos? If we say so-and-so is seemingly tired of the rat race, well, are they really? Or do they unconsciously prefer the rat race for some odd reasons? And what would those reasons then be? Well, I think I think a great reason that I've seen has to do with someone, a philosopher named Blaise Pascal. He said, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And I'd say that this was picked up too by Albert Camus, the philosopher later, who basically said the same thing, perhaps just simply repeating it. And a third time I heard this mentioned by a very famous singer who at one point struggling went to a retreat setting and took up a cabin with almost nothing in it for a week. And he found himself saying it was very illuminating, sitting in a room all alone, basically. In other words, with no radio, no TV, no internet, no nothing, just alone, and with no friends. Indeed, many people say that we're social animals, but what if part of that socializing animal, quote, nature is simply a tendency to want to not be alone in a room, like these philosophers are talking about, whereby we're terrified often of being all alone. So we find all kinds of ways not to be, and what better way of making this happen than living in urban areas or suburban areas. This concept, too, is discussed, I've seen, in an article in Catholic World Report, May 15th, 2021. The title of the article being The Coronavirus and Sitting Quietly in a Room Alone. So, I think a number of people are talking of this, and thus how urban life and how it makes us run around like chickens with our heads cut off, and arguably very easily bipolar diagnosable to account for this. This is all quite understandable, I think. In fact, when I was trying to meditate some when I was in a very challenging environment back in 2008, I found it very difficult to meditate because all kinds of troubling thoughts were popping to the surface. I was finding myself, quote, sitting alone in a room because I wasn't playing a TV, radio, socializing, walking around, any of that. The meditation was forcing me to sit alone in a room, literally, figuratively, every which way. Well, I suppose urban life is the antithesis and a partial cure, even a defense mechanism, you might say, but at heavy costs. I would say, too, that it can be very profitable for many people in certain professions to find others termed, quote, mentally ill, sometimes, quote, seriously mentally ill. And the diagnosis of bipolar is the one of two diagnoses termed a serious disorder. But some others would say this is a matter of medicalization, of what you would call a very understandable and very frequent process, especially during the proceeding of industrialization and beyond, and overpopulated circumstances in general, and social fabrics falling apart. And I'm not the only one to talk of this. There have been the people like Dr. Saz in New York, but also even Garrison Keillor in a video I watched a year ago by him, the man who led a Prairie Home Companion from Minnesota and did shows in New York City too. He said himself he found it disturbing, the encroachment of medicalization on things that are quite ordinary and commonplace and normal. In fact, all things considered. So I don't think I'm barking up the wrong tree to say that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatry has morphed from perhaps 100 diagnoses way back in the 50s to over 500 now. And it's only going to get more and more expanded until almost everything is called a mental disorder, to the benefit of some. Indeed, I would even say that it can be beneficial to some people in society for others to be called seriously mentally ill, because they're then stigmatized in society and considered a danger, like in the sense of them possibly going postal or being highly unstable and a threat then to a company who might be worried about lawsuits too. And so these people get shunted into low-wage positions, whether fast food or bagging groceries, etc., never allowed to progress into management even if they wanted to. They're locked out, basically, of all corporate work of any significance or professional work, which then I would say provides a lot of fodder for these wage slave positions, these wage slave jobs. For I've seen a number of people working at grocery stores holding 2 or 3 jobs, probably diagnosed with bipolar or something else. And this then renders them wage slaves for the rest of their lives, and they have to work 2, 3 jobs oftentimes to pay for a tiny, tiny rat-infested apartment in urban areas, doing jobs that otherwise they would never even want to do. But they're forced to, especially if married and children are on the scene. Now, I suppose, though, that some people would say, well, the criteria for bipolar disorder are quite obvious and not just related to this so-called initial manic episode. It's often brought up that the people speak too fast, or they have overindulgence in sex, or risky sex. But isn't that part and parcel then of sexaholism? Or even the equivalent being if you wanted to have a Thanksgiving 8-course meal every night of the week, 365. You can overdo anything, of course, as a defense mechanism to soothe your fears in general. And then there are the issues talked of by psychiatrists relating to their diagnosis of bipolar when it comes to sleep deficiency, whereby the bipolar person, so to speak, is called sleep deficient. Well, I would say, based on my own personal experience and that of most people, that when you're under stress, fear, even terror feelings, or simply starting a new business or looking for work, or you're poverty-stricken or have a lot of bills you can't pay or medical problems you can't pay for, well, of course you're going to be so stressed out you can't sleep well. So is this a biological condition to have poor sleep out of worry? Is it biological to worry, or rather have trouble with overindulgence in sex? Is it biological to erase your thoughts, to block out the painful things? Well, I think we would want to think about this. And then when we're so tired of struggling that we just want to give up, basically, and say it's hopeless, I guess we shift into depression, or what's called, in my mind, being bummed out. And this only reinforces all the more the concept of this mood fluctuation stuff being cited. Now, too, I would finally say that these diagnoses would not be rendered without some kind of treatment available. And while drugs of choice for this used to be very, very expensive and very, very side effect laden, things have come a long way in both respects. And now the drug side effect profile is less, and the whole matter of cost has changed too, with Social Security offering Part D Medicare, same with Medicaid, and disability payments becoming more and more common for these so-called mental disorders, like quote bipolar disorder. So then a person could be said to be suffering from a disease and not even be able to support themselves then, bagging groceries, and simply collect a check called disability checks. And their quote medications to suppress their fears, just basically tranquilizers in my mind, especially lithium, a huge tranquilizer found very effective initially for guinea pigs by Mr. Cade. This all effectively being tranquilizers, I say, to tranquilize fear or terror, like terror over living in Urbania or modern life in general. And if it helps one feel less hopeless, then I suppose it would render the depression less too, thus supposedly smoothing out moods. But we're just basically smoothing out fear, I think, that either causes us to run around like chickens with our heads cut off or be really bummed out. Either way, if you smooth out the fears, you smooth out both of these. And arguably, you've rendered moods more stable and same-o, but that would happen if you simply go to sleep, wouldn't it? Your moods are going to be very stable when you're asleep because you're not thinking, and thus you're not fearful when you're asleep. But that doesn't mean sleep is acting as a mood stabilizer, does it? And who gets diagnosed the most with so-called bipolar disorder? I suppose it's the poor, who have the lowest paying jobs and the most unstable jobs, the poorest ability to think logically and remember things and parse things out and plan, make things happen, build careers. Of course their lives are more unstable and chaotic. They're always reeling from one disaster to another. So they're always terrified. And then who do you think would get the diagnosis of mood shifts more often? Well, the poor. So I would say then that I cannot say that I'm for sure about any of this matter, but these are my observations and thoughts, which hopefully I think, I hope I'm conveying that my level of somewhat uncertainty is an honest approach rather than saying I'm definitely sure I'm right and someone else is wrong. And furthermore, I would emphasize I'm not a medical doctor, nor do I have a PhD in psychology. And I'll just let that rest at that with one caveat, and that is that I think I have a lot more life experience of a variety of nature and a lot more time on my hands to observe, think, write it down, discuss it, etc. than 99.99% of doctors and people with PhDs in this field, or as they claim to be their field only. So, again, I would emphasize I'm not a medical doctor or have a PhD in psychology, and perhaps that's not a problem. Perhaps it's a good thing, in fact. And I would, again, triply emphasize I'm not 100% sure of what I'm saying. Verify it with your own experiences, your own observations, your own thinking. And consider, too, the advice of those who aren't doing any of that because they're too busy working and too busy writing and too busy lecturing, too busy going to school, getting degrees that take 12 years. So, again, I hope this is useful. I don't mean it to be definitive. I cannot even prove to you right now that I know anything definitively, including that I'm alive. I can't tell you for sure I'm not in a matrix right now, a bunch of ones and zeros. I can't tell you I'm not dreaming right now, and will wake up 50 years from now and realize I was dreaming. So I hope I'm conveying I can't be sure 100% of what I'm saying. I can't even be sure I'm here talking into this microphone right now, for sure. But I hope what I'm talking about makes a little sense at least, and go out there and verify it if you haven't spent much time already thinking about this. I hope it jogs at least some questions for those stigmatized at least, to examine whether this stigma is warranted so that they can recover some self-esteem at least. Even if they wish to use tranquilizers, let's say called mood stabilizers, and find that most effective because they're stuck in urban areas with bad jobs, low pay, and a lot of insecure situations in general. I wish you well. Good day.